been able to service our clients, and we've seen the volumes going up massively. Now, the problem was certainly on the valuation of the equity market has suffered quite importantly. We've seen, nevertheless, an extraordinary and unprecedented additional issuances on the bond market that quickly came into play. As a result, you may have heard that the European Union, for example, became a first-time issuers of a massive borrowing program just to support the pandemic. And the European Union was one, but there were obviously additional other governments that decided to issue in a similar manner. So, just to mention, on the Euroclear side, we've seen the asset under custody increasing by 8%, and we've seen the transaction increasing by 12%. So that's a good numbers considering the pandemic and considering the difficulties in the market. Now, what I wanted to say as well is that in terms of settlement activity, as I mentioned, there's been a very big turnover on the settlement, and we reached for the first time ever an excess of $1,000 trillion equivalent. That has been achieved in 55 different currencies. So, that situation that never happened to us. So we're very proud to be able to service that and in a robust manner as well. The GCC economies are mainly driven by oil as an oil exporter. So needless to say that during the pandemic, we all faced a situation where the oil became even negative. So that created some problems in terms of a budget, government's budget in the region. That's why we've started seeing a lot of interest for those governments to look at potentially borrowing in the bond market. So that has been done. Saudi Arabia has increased its borrowing program. We've seen that in the UAE as well. The 7 Emirates in the UAE actually were issuing in the bond market, in the international bond market, but the UAE federal government never did so in the past. And just recently, together with a cooperation with the Central Bank of the UAE and Euroclear, we actually partnering with the UAE federal government under the leadership of the Ministry of Finance with Maktoum bin Rashid Al Maktoum, His Excellency, just to establish this UAE federal issuances for the first time ever. So they will start issuing in local currency, i.e. in dirhams, and that is coming in May. So we're very proud to be associated as well to that launch. But that is certainly the result of the pandemic, because as I said, the oil price was uncertain, even went negative. Now it's back to the very high, but is it going to stay at that level? Nobody really knows. So I think it's being helped with the crisis today in Russia and Ukraine, but it's probably going to normalize and stabilize a bit more. So there's a clear intention in the GCC just to establish a robust and solid debt capital market, creating a yield curve on the government level. Once the yield curve is created, then you get the possibility for the corporate to get a benchmark. And the corporate, the government-related entities, or the pure corporates in the region will also be able then to access that capital market. It's a very good question because, as I said, there were literally no bond market in the region, with a few exceptions. I know Egypt was a very well-established capital market as well. As I mentioned, Saudi Arabia still have room to grow because the debt to GDP is very, very small compared to the European one or the US one or the more established economies. So there is room to grow, but that growth needs to be done in capturing as well the international investors' interest. At the moment, everything that was done in the region was actually self-suppliance. So, you had these domestic investors base that were actually capturing all those issuances. Now, the challenge for those countries here in the region would be to be able to attract those international investors in an efficient way. And I think what has been done over the years now is to change a bit the law, accommodate a bit more the international investors' interest and way of working. So we're talking about a nominee account instead of having a final beneficiary account. We're talking the possibility to doing settlement in a standard way, which is called a delivery versus payment. So there's a lot of things that those markets have actually changed in terms of their infrastructure, even on the tax law, just to accommodate that. And we're very proud to have been able to help those governments, Ministry of Finance, but also the debt management offices, just to support that transformation in the market. And that the GCC is really evolving into an international standard as opposed to a domestic standard. So that opens up massive possibilities for governments and corporations just to get the international investors' interest. Yeah, so the DLT, it's a very interesting topic. It's on the agenda of everyone's. So what we do is that basically, our business is very particular. The securities business, we look at the whole chain. And in the chain, you get from the pre-issuances, you get the issuance process, you get the primary market distribution, you get the secondary market, you've got collateral management that comes on back of it, but then you get the whole servicing on the assets, i.e. the custody part, the corporate actions, the tax side, etc. So, you know, we get so many different processes that are embedded into the system that when we look at DLT, we look rather at DLT, how can we use the DLT technology to improve some of the processes along the chain? We're not saying that we should change the system of Euroclear to a DLT. I think some markets have tried to do so and they failed because the biggest concern in the securities market, as I mentioned, was the numbers that I quoted. It's such a big market that is interoperated between each other that the one and the mover that will go into the DLT will probably isolate it from the international securities market. So you need to be able to leverage the good part of the DLT, improving your processes, making, for example, the pre-issuance is a very interesting one because today it takes so many days to issue a bond. With the DLT and the smart contracts, you can potentially improve that pre-issuance processes. So it means that an issuer wouldn't have to wait for a certain number of days before he can actually launch his bonds, which means that he could actually tap into the market when the market conditions are right as well. And that DLT will be able to provide. But as I said, you know, considering the amount of money that we're managing, and we need a resilient and scalable system. And as we speak, I mean, the DLT has not been able to provide us that comfort. So yes, to answer your question, we will continue using DLT, but to improve the processes. Now, the second part of your question was the consortium of Finality. So yes, Euroclear took a big investment into Finality because we're fully convinced that Finality and the consortium of banks that actually joined that, the Finality, is focusing on what we call the central bank digital currency. So there's no doubt that governments will look more and more, and probably sooner than later, at introducing a legitimate central bank digital currency. But that will have to be done in parallel with what exists today. So today, you know, we've got banknotes, we have the currency as we know, and what we manage today is that kind of currency. Now, tomorrow, with a central bank digital currency, is going to be something that is very exciting because leveraging, again, the DLT technology, you will be able just to continue offering both to your clients. So you will have bonds issuances in digital way using central bank digital currency, and you will continue having bonds leveraging the traditional circuit, if I may say. So MFEX stands for Mutual Funds Exchange. It's a leading independent fund distribution platform that Euroclear Group acquired 6 months ago. So that was missing as part of the Euroclear offering, and I will explain to you. Because, you know, Euroclear was offering an execution platform known as a trading and custody platform, but this is only a part of the value chain of the fund transactions. And MFEX is actually complementing that value chain. MFEX specializes as a fund distribution platform, as I mentioned, and they do provide services to the fund management companies. They help the fund management companies just to be able to distribute their funds globally. They help the fund management companies to understand using and leveraging the data of what they see on the distribution side, They help them to understand where their mutual funds are actually being traded, who's actually owning those mutual funds, etc. So they're bringing transparencies into the equation. And I think what the fund managers is really looking at is that kind of transparency to understand who is the client base, how the funds compare to the peers. So, MFEX is having that kind of a solution as well, helping the fund management company using and leveraging the data space. And let's face it, mixing the two between Euroclear and MFEX, and by the way, we rebranded MFEX as MFEX by Euroclear, so that gives the best of both worlds. That gives the efficiency on the processing, but also the expertise on the fund distribution. So, Euroclear has always been at the forefront on the ESG, and as a matter of fact, ESG is a key pillar of the coming strategy of Euroclear. Why is that? Because we know that every economy has to do an ESG transformation. Okay? Every economy has to create its own taxonomy. In Europe, there's a very stringent taxonomy with 150,000 pages. Okay, so, and everything is very well described and explained into that EU taxonomy. Now, we're not saying this is the best taxonomy, but what we're saying is that every country is actually looking at that particular EU taxonomy. So it's a good foundation for the others. To ensure that we are successful on the ESG as well, we have recently acquired a company called Greenemy. It's a RegTech company that actually worked very closely with the EU, and they have created to support the taxonomy, because as you mentioned, the taxonomy requires some reporting obligation. And those reporting obligations actually must be done by corporation, must be done by issuers of mutual funds, issuers of bonds, issuers of ETF. Okay? So the whole objective is that if you have that platform that can capture that mandatory reporting obligation, you've got data. And if you have data, then you can actually give those data to the investors, to the asset owners. And with those data, the asset owners or the investors will be able to make their own investment decision, but using a certain standard under a local taxonomy or under the EU taxonomy. So they will know exactly what is required. And I think we're extremely excited to go through that journey, because that has been recognized by a PwC white paper that there will be a need of raising $25 trillion of capital just to support those ESG transformation. And Euroclear as a financial market infrastructure, we want to be part of that. We want to make sure that we can standardize that process, but that we can accommodate the different taxonomies across the world into a reporting platform and leveraging and using the data as an enabler for the investors to make their own decision. Well, it's a bit more already than 50 years, so we've done that anniversary already. But if I look back 50 years ago, a bit more than 50 years ago, Euroclear was set up to create the Eurobond market. 50 years after, that Eurobond market still exists and is very predominant. It's a multi-currency international bond market. Everyone knows about it. Big issuers, everyone has issued into that international Eurobond market. But we didn't want to stand still on that one. So Eurobond is one asset class. And over the years, Euroclear has managed to develop an additional connection to 50 different markets. And then you start adding up new asset classes on top of the Eurobonds. You are adding up the European government bonds, the European corporate bonds, the US, Latin America, Middle East bond, etc. So it's becoming a real ecosystem. And it's not only on the bond side, but it's also on the equity side. It's also on the mutual funds with the recent acquisition that we mentioned. It's also on the ETF. It's becoming also private equity. So you see, the objective of Euroclear is leveraging its capacity that has been demonstrated over the last 50 years as being a solid financial market infrastructure, an efficient financial market infrastructure, but making sure that we can add up new asset classes, and not to forget what we mentioned on ESG. ESG is on the top of the agenda for us. and we want to transform the financial market into a more sustainable financial market. And Euroclear will be certainly a very big part of that transformation. We strive to move from what we call a Euroclear ability. So it's everything that transacts in Euroclear, we call that Euroclear ability, into a more sustainability way of doing the settlement and the custody in the securities market.